Hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. I'm here today with the lovely Kelly.
Hello.
And the incredible Kellyanne.
Hello, hello.
And I'm Emma. And per usual, we are a couple of women talking. And we're today going to talk about the Oscar-nominated movie, Women Talking. So strap in, because this is going to be a good one. Let's do it. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
Without expectation or judgment,
we will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
Alrighty, folks. So, in case you don't know, if you haven't been paying attention for the past 2 years, we review an Oscar movie every year.
We do.
And this year, we have a pretty formidable feminist film up for Best Picture, which is very exciting. That's not always the case. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's slim pickings for a woman-focused Oscar nom film. Yep. So, we're going to talk about Women Talking. If you haven't seen Women Talking yet, then what are you doing? Go to the movie theater, check it out. It's a great, great flick. Oh no, spoilers of what I think of it. This will contain spoilers about the movie. Mm-hmm. To give a little summary of what this movie is about, it is about a group of women at a Mennonite colony. This is inspired by a true story of real events that happened to women in a Bolivian Mennonite colony, which then became a novel that was inspired by those true events and is now a film, and has now been transplanted into, I believe, the United States. It's about this group of women in this colony who have been very isolated from the outside world. They are illiterate. They didn't go through schooling. They didn't receive the opportunity to go through schooling. And they have been afflicted by what they thought were some sort of demon or some sort of ghost, sin, curse, something, which was them waking up and realizing that they had been raped in their sleep. So also, let me put out a trigger warning on this because we are going to be talking about rape, sexual assault, abuse, domestic violence, all of those things. So this is a heavy movie. But they have been afflicted by this, and then they wind up catching one of the men in their colony, attempting to sneak in to commit this act that multiple men within the community have been doing to the women. And they basically are confronted with the obstacle of, do we forgive these men? Because the men of the colony are saying you have to forgive them in order to remain in the colony and also in order to still have access into the kingdom of heaven when you die. So their salvation is hinging on this. And then if they leave, they will lose that privilege if they leave the colony, on top of the fact that they have never lived outside of this colony before. And then their other option that they've created for themselves is they could also stay and fight the men and fight for their rights within the colony, fight for some justice, whatever that could look like. The women take a vote, and it's a three-way tie.
Two-way tie.
Two-way tie.
Yeah, it's a two-way tie between fighting and leaving.
Between fighting and leaving. Mm-hmm. So it's, yes, okay, you're right. So staying is in the minority. Staying and forgiving them is in the minority. And they wind up selecting a couple of women from some of the, I guess, like the main families or the more like leader families within the community to essentially hash it out and decide for the community because they had this tie vote. So the whole movie is them sitting in a barn, those women that have been selected, and talking. They're talking through what are their options. They're talking through the pros and cons. They are processing in real time the trauma that they've been through. And we see all sorts of different reactions to that trauma. We see all sorts of interesting thought processes. And then there is one man who is present throughout the film who is the school teacher. He is their note taker.
He's taking the minutes.
Yes, he's taking the minutes of the meeting. although none of them can read. And so he's taking the minutes for the sake of a record of what was happening that day, not really for the sake of them looking back on it since they can't read, but as a way to sort of memorialize what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Am I missing anything in terms of the synopsis?
I think that this was implied, but to be clear, the women in the colony were told by the men that their afflictions were caused by devils. So it wasn't just a matter of like the women had just assumed like, oh, we've been attacked by Satan. They were explicitly told from the men when they came with these problems, like our girls are waking up with blood and all these things. And so the men in the colony were
they were
basically quelling
them.
their concerns by saying, oh, it's the devil.
Yeah, something we didn't touch on as well is that the men are not there.
Mm-hmm.
So this man that was sneaking into a bedroom that was caught, and he accused a few others, or he said, these are the other people doing this. They all are in prison or jail right now, and all the men have left to post bail for these men. So their attackers are coming back into the community, or that is the hope. And so these women have a set amount of time to decide what they will do, which is what they need to figure out before the men come back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's kind of that's the problem that we're faced with at the start of the film. That is what these women are working through. And at the end of the film, they do decide to leave. They decide to choose independence. They decide to choose freedom. They decide to sort of break away from the mold that they've been given their entire lives. And the women leave en masse from the colony. And so that's kind of the whole thing. So first, ladies, what did you think of the film? What were your first impressions? Give me the deets.
I mean, I thought it was stunning. I went into the film with not very many expectations based on the trailer that I had seen. And I don't know, I just heard nothing about it. And so I just kind of went in with a very open mind. And in the first 20 minutes, I was kind of like, I don't know about this. And I think maybe less so other elements, but mainly it was the script that captured my heart by the end of it, that there's just so many deep thoughts and so many, I don't know, poignant examples of the process of deconstructing and the process of dealing with trauma and like finding healing and all those things that came out that were just really beautiful to me, kind of encapsulated in this like hour and a half long conversation among women. And so it's very rare that you see that in a film in Hollywood these days. And so I don't know. I thought it was really beautiful. And it has, I mean, it's talking about a very specific set of things, but it's a microcosm of bigger questions and bigger issues. And I just found it very thought-provoking. Can't wait to actually sit down and read the script.
Yeah. I loved this movie. I was gripped pretty much from the very beginning to the very end. Like, it was really interesting. Like, my mom came with us to see it, and like chatting with her, she was like, oh, it was really slow. And I was like, really? Like, I didn't pick up on that at all. I was like instantly enthralled with these women's dialogue of the different way they're processing and their different responses and trying to figure out what their thoughts are because they haven't been given permission to have opinions.
Yeah.
And so I really felt like the movie touched on such a broad spectrum of experiences and opinions, and then it even explored and slowly revealed why these women might have their opinions that they do, or why you're seeing the reactions that they're having. And I loved that. It felt like the same thing can be happening to a bunch of different people, but they're all going to be experiencing it and expressing their needs in very different ways. And I thought that was really, really beautiful. It was really a nod to healing, recovery, mental health. I mean, it really touched on a lot, which was beautiful.
It did. That was one thing that was surprising to me was that it covers so many different aspects of the female experience. And it felt very relatable despite not being a Mennonite, not being a Mennonite woman who's been isolated. Oh, one thing we didn't mention is that this is like in modern day is when this is set. It's 2010 when the movie is happening, although it feels like it's like 1920 or something because you're sort of teleported into this very isolated non-technological world where the Mennonite colony is, which was fascinating, but I felt so deeply like I could relate to so many of the women that were in the ensemble cast, and like that there was so much that hit home. And I agree, it didn't feel slow to me. It felt actually, when the movie ended, I was like, it kind of shocked me that it was over already. I was like, oh, it's already done. Like that went by so fast. And
which is hard to do considering the setting, right?
Yes.
Like it's for the most part, the whole film takes place in a barn.
Yes.
You know,
in
like
just
in just like a
one room.
loft.
Yeah.
And so, and then, there's like cutback scenes and different things throughout that sort of break it up. But for the most part, it's just like
this is where you are.
10 women sitting around in a circle talking. And there's like events that happen within their conversation that like keep you engaged the whole time, which I think is brilliant. Again, I attribute that to the script. Just
it was very gripping. And their performances. Like, those women gave it all. They left it all in the barn. They really like brought it when it came to really encapsulating their characters. And some of them are really famous actresses that we've seen in other things. And like, I did not feel like I saw them, I saw their character.
Yep.
And going back to like the script and what it felt like it was a play to me.
I actually was going to say that it really does read like a play.
Yeah. It reminded me a lot of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom that came out a couple years ago, which is a movie based off a play where it's pretty much all in one room. It was a similar vibe, although I think I prefer woman talking over that one. But it definitely read like this was a play at some point, especially also with the script and the very sort of philosophical dialogue is something I think you hear a lot in plays. But I also wonder if maybe those are lines taken directly from the book and kind of transplanted onto there, because the concepts that they're breaching are very fascinating, and they are really like diving into like morals and ethics and what it means to be a person. And it does kind of read like a novel that is more pensive. And they're kind of monologuing their inner thoughts in a way that people don't do in real life. But it was really captivating for sure. So, women. What in this movie really hit home for you? Like, of the many things that I'm sure hit home, like what hit you in the gut with this movie? What made you feel the deepest?
I think for me, I sort of alluded to this earlier, but kind of how this film is sort of a microcosm of greater conversations. And I think for anybody in the deconstruction space, especially women, like it's a perfect film to see because it reflected back to me so much of my process, not having been sexually assaulted and like experienced such violence. That hasn't happened to me in my life. I'm very thankful for that. But I have witnessed that happen to other women, and I have seen discrepancies in like the church authority and like how discrepancies between the church authority and how they act and what they preach and what they believe, right? Yeah. And so you have all these women who have like come into this believing and truly like their faith is astounding, like the way that it's represented in the film. It's just beautiful. And how much they are genuinely trying to do what's right and what God would want and what would be most appropriate for their faith and most appropriate for their children. And like, what is the most, they're not asking the question like, how do I service my anger? They're asking like, what would be the most loving response to this in the midst of feeling all the feelings that they have. And so I thought it was just like the philosophical element of it was so beautiful in that sense for me. And it felt very much like this is where my deconstruction started, was in that cognitive dissonance of the people we used to once trust or used to once hold the greatest authority in our minds are no longer safe. They're no longer representative of what I understand the gospel to be. And so now we have to figure out another way to think about this. I actually have a quote that I would love to read. I mean, there's 100 quotes from this film that we could read over and over again. But like, I really want to just like write them all down. But in the conversation of should we leave or should we stay, Greta, one of the older women who sort of represents like the grandmother generation, she says, leaving will give us the far more seeing perspective we need to forgive. Because there's this whole conversation revolves around, can we forgive them? Like, can you be forced to forgive someone without like having an option? Like, is it forgiveness if you never had a choice in the first place? Which is all beautiful stuff. So, and then she goes on and says, which is to love properly and to keep the peace according to our faith. Therefore, our leaving wouldn't be an act of cowardice or abandonment. It wouldn't be because we were excommunicated or exiled. It would be a supreme act of faith, a step towards love and forgiveness. Leaving is how we demonstrate our faith. We are leaving because our faith is stronger than the rules, bigger than our life. And as someone who has been through the ringer with the church in my own journey and I've been processing the stepping out and how I live and who I am and what it means to be spiritual now. Just this idea of sometimes when you look in the face of so much pain and so much harm that's been caused, like the idea that walking away could be the greatest act of faith in that situation, not to like stay and continue to like submit yourself to abuse, not to fight and tear it all down, but to like move on so that you can forge your own path. I don't know, it's just beautiful. And I haven't stopped thinking about it since I watched the film. So
it makes you think of something that I believe Claire Foy's character says near the beginning, which is that surely God would be able to find them even if they leave the colony. Like because the men are telling them, you will not have access to God anymore if you leave. And she was like, if God could come down as a man and like die and resurrect, surely God could find a few women that left the colony. And it's this strength of faith that you see from them, that although they've been largely indoctrinated and taught by these men, their faith is bigger than what these men say. And that's fascinating. And it's interesting that they feel that they have the agency to think deeply about their faith independent of the men. Which is something that a lot of people don't feel. They feel that they need to have a pastor and authority that is feeding them all of the knowledge and wisdom of God. Whereas these women have found and mustered the agency within themselves to say, no, I actually can discern the wisdom of God myself. And that's super powerful and like really unique, I think.
Yeah, I would say I resonated with a lot in this film.
Yes.
But one of the things that really stuck out to me specifically was one of the characters, Ona, who is pregnant from one of her attackers, from one of presumably her attackers. No one really knows because these women have been given cow tranquilizers. So they've been assaulted in their sleep, which is so insane to me. But she almost like isn't fully like, it seems like as a character, maybe she's not fully recognizing the extent of the abuse that's happened to her or her trauma, because she's very like out in, like she's one of the people that like they would say isn't like really grounded in reality. She's very...
I would like type her as like, if all the women represent a way to deal with trauma, like hers to me is dissociation.
Yeah, she's very disassociated, for sure. And like, she's about to have a baby, and like
she's unmarried.
She's unmarried.
Didn't ask to have a baby. Yeah,
literally doesn't want to get married. Like straight up was like, if I got married, then her and August seem to have a history.
August, the school teacher.
The school teacher who's taking the minutes.
Yeah.
And he loves her dearly. And she loves him. But she says, I would not be myself married. Yeah. And I'm like, listen, girl, respect. Like, you do your thing. But I really resonated with this character of Ona, of like, seeing the mystery of the world, seeing everything that the world has to offer and wanting to be almost like enchanted by it instead of dealing with what has happened to her. I'm like, yeah, I get you. Like that is, I get that. But also recognizing as all of these women are truly trying to work out what the best decision is. They really have to explore all options and talk through them and wrestle with the implications of what that would mean. And I saw myself in a lot of that as they talked through. I'm like, yeah, like when you've been told what to think and what to believe and what you even are and what you're capable of your entire life, yeah, it's fucking exhausting to try and make a decision. And so as we see them explore all options, I'm like, wow, I really tend to do that in my own life. I will really consider things and, you know, do the pros and cons type of situation, think about the logistics way before I've even made a decision to think about the logistics for. And like seeing them work that out in real time and how each of them react very differently for specific reasons as it kind of unfolds. I'm like, yeah, it's exhausting to teach yourself how to think, basically. And like, we're seeing this happen in real time.
Well, and to add on to that, one of her quotes that I really loved was she's talking on and on about thoughtful, like up in the sky sort of things. And her, I don't know, friend or I don't know, sister says, you're a dreamer. And she says, we're women without a voice. All we have are our dreams.
Yeah.
And it's like, it kind of encapsulates like her, the way that she's dealt with all of this is to hold tightly to what she does have, which is her imagination and her ability to think, I guess, on her own accord, regardless of who's listening.
Yep.
And I liked that a lot.
I liked that a lot too. And I think for like applying this practically in real life, I have found a lot of people that tend to err in that space, or even myself, like it's because they don't have the tools yet to deal with the trauma. And so like finding beauty and mystery in life in the meantime is really sacred and precious. And it's out of self-preservation. And so I loved getting to see that like play out on the screen. Yeah. I also loved the fucking angry moms because I was like, yeah, queen, you be angry. You be angry in a way that is unacceptable to your community because guess what? No one's been listening to you and you have a voice now. So use it. A lot of the women were like, oh my God, like, why are you so angry? Just calm down. I'm like, yeah, she should be angry. But also like valuing like these more stoic responses and how to navigate this tough situation because you can't have everything all at once, right? You want revenge, but you also want to be safe and you want like, and they're trying to weigh all of these things out. And I'm like, damn, but also, yeah, be angry.
Yeah, that reveal, because Claire Foy's character, Salome, is probably, there's one of two of the most like angry moms. And that the point at which they kind of reveal the thing that is like fueling her fire, I was just like,
yeah,
in tears.
Yeah.
About her daughter?
Yes, because basically, like, throughout the film, you, like, know that she has a daughter who's sick, and you can probably, like, kind of, like, put together the pieces, but she, like, puts it all out on the table, and you realize her 4-year-old daughter has been assaulted and now has an STD.
Yeah.
And, like, this mom, like, walked a day and a half both ways to get her daughter antibiotics, like, and now, like, she's healing from a literal STD at 4 years old.
Yeah.
Like,
Which did they explicitly say she had an STD? Because I was a little confused on that front.
They didn't say it, but it made sense.
It was strongly implied.
They drew the line that
it definitely implied that, like, they talked about her being raped. Like, they did definitely hint to that.
Yeah.
But I was confused until you guys started saying like that she had an STD. I was like, oh, I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah, well, because they talked about, like, throughout the film, they talk about how these women have been assaulted, brutalized, and, like, diseased as a result. So it's, like, you know that there's some kind of, like, syphilis or something, like, circulating because they're talking about, like, the women being sick. Anyways, like, she says all that, and I'm like, of course you're fucking mad.
Yeah.
You know? Like,
Yeah.
why aren't you madder? You know?
Yeah. You
like,
should
why
be
does everybody else
murdering-
matter? Like, how the heck are these other women, like, holding on to their sanity and, like,
Totally.
I don't know, in the wake of that type of news?
Yeah. Like, your justice button should be, like freaking out. And, like, the other woman that was really angry, and I would argue more angry, actually, than Claire Foy's character, but it's revealed at the end of towards the end of the movie that she's been, like, so abused by her husband, like, their entire relationship. And at one point, I don't remember what sparked this, but she turns around and she says to the group, "You act like I've had a choice."
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to remember that some women are angry because they have not been given choices. And a lot of women, the bad situations they're in are not because of their choices.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe someone says to her, because she's saying they should stay and fight.
Yeah.
And
she's like, I'll gut
someone
you.
says to her, how could you advocate for us to stay and fight when you've allowed your husband to abuse you?
Yep. Which, whoo!
Oh, yeah. And like she turns to them and she's like, what? That's when she says that. What would make you think that I had the choice? Whereas maybe she's gauging in this scenario, she has the power of all the women of the colony behind her. Whereas before, the women of the colony turned their heads to it. Like even her own mother, which they have that conversation too, which was heart-wrenching, where her mother apologizes for not standing up for her, for being complicit and knowing she's being abused. And probably most of them know she's being abused because she shows up with bruises and broken bones and all sorts of things. I'm sure, like, from her husband's abuse, like, it is repetitive and it is consistent. Like, that's the impression that you get. And so that's it. It's the justification for why she is so angry and why she's at this tipping point.
Yeah.
Now.
For sure.
But something that hit home for me, along with pretty much all the things that you two are saying, is the way that this movie illustrates how patriarchy and misogyny hurts everybody. They talk about how the sons of the colony have been good students to the men, in that the men have taught them and raised them in how to abuse power, in how to essentially hate women in this sense. And later on, they say the same thing. I think it's actually when the mother apologizes to Marieke about allowing her husband to abuse her. She says, we were good students too. They were students to the women of how to submit, how to not fight, how to not advocate for themselves. And then later on, when they've finally decided they're going to leave, they are debating whether they should bring any of the sons with them. And at what age do they cut that off?
Right.
And they turn to August, the school teacher, and they're like, you teach these boys. What do you think about it? And he has this monologue where he talks about the danger of adolescent boys. And it actually kind of faked me out, because it seemed as though he was going to say, they're irredeemable. Yep. And at the end he says, but they can be taught how to be good. And it was really powerful. And the reason that all these people are hurting is because they're part of a system that dehumanizes a group over the other. And so it's hurting these boys. It's changing these boys. It's hurting someone like August, who you see is deeply tortured as a person. And obviously it's hurting all of these women at the same time. And so that was fascinating to see the arc, or sort of the umbrella over the film, of how this system and this pattern of abuse has hurt everybody. And I feel like that's something that we harp on a lot here on Woman Being, is that systems of domination and of power and that belittle another group are hurting the ones in power as well. And so I loved that about the film. There were so many things within the story that hit, which was surprising. And it was fascinating to me to see, well, we've already touched on the way that it showed like every possible response to trauma. We saw the one woman who has a panic attack as a response to trauma, and she's told by one of the other women, "Why are you so dramatic? Why do you have to make a show about this?" And you realize she has no control over that. She's like, "We've all been in the same abuse. Why are you the one who has panic attacks?" You see reacting with like violence and aggression with Claire Foy's character, who tries to assault one of the men that she finds out is perpetrating these acts of violence, to the point where she says if she stays, she'll become a murderer, which is interesting that they're like, well, we can't become murderers, although these men have done these deeply, deeply twisted acts against us, but like they don't want to respond with what they would call sin, you know? They don't want to respond to sin with sin, which is fascinating.
That was fascinating.
Yeah. We see the woman who has stayed quiet with Marieke, who is now choosing to want to fight. We see, what's her name? I keep wanting to call her Orla. Ona, who dissociates, who's kind of in her own world. It was so interesting that we saw that span of it, but one that I think wasn't a response to the abuse, but that kind of plays on a trope of something people will say as a response to abuse, is Melvin, who is the trans man in the community, which they were a pretty minor character off to the side, but it made me think about the way that people who are anti-trans will talk about trans people, in that they must have been abused in their childhood for them to have decided this for themselves, which is a twisted way of looking at somebody's humanity. But we see Melvin talk about how or as we hear Melvin's story, we hear that they had always felt that they were not female, that they were not a woman. And then it seemed as though the abuse was maybe a tipping point to like dive fully into that identity, but it was not what created that identity. And that was really interesting as a take, which was unexpected in a setting like that, to even see somebody who was living as a trans person in a Mennonite community. Felt very out of left field, but it was like a very fascinating story.
Yeah, it was super fascinating. And I loved, because Melvin did not speak to the adults. Yeah. He only spoke to the children.
Yeah.
And you see the still kind of maybe typical female role that Melvin still assumes, which is taking care of all the younger children, which I found was interesting in this context. But the only time you hear Melvin speak is when someone in the community uses his name.
Yeah.
And you see him respond with like, "Wow, thank you for using my name." And it's like, wow, when you offer someone respect, they're like, okay. Yeah. Like, I feel like safer to say thank you. Yeah. And I'm like, what a like beautiful moment that was.
Yeah, it was really beautiful.
I appreciate Melvin's inclusion in this story, but I also found it frustrating. And I find this is something I'll find frustrating in general. Where I think representation is so important, so I'm not against having trans people in movies. However, I do find it frustrating when you put trans people or underrepresented people in a movie and then give them like barely any story. And so that was frustrating to me. It felt like, oh, and then like the cherry on top is now the Mennonites are chill with his new gender identity, so
Like,
Moving
did it feel
along, we're all good.
a little gratuitous?
Yeah, it felt like pandering. And when I know like an issue like that, like they could have done a whole film about the women talking about his identity.
Sure.
You know, like there's so much complexity there and complication and like so much to the trans experience that goes beyond just like being called your name.
Totally.
So that was my one criticism is I almost would have omitted that just out of the sake of like if you're not going to do it justice. I don't know. But again, I understand that representation is important. So I don't know. I felt very conflicted about that part of the movie because it just
No, I get that. And I've had thoughts about that as well. And in terms of, is this just there to like tick the box?
right.
I do think that Melvin is a character in the book as well, which to me gives it a little bit more stock. But that is, it's that sort of catch-22 of, okay, if we don't include someone like him, then we're not including anyone.
Right.
But if we do, and this is someone who's a very small plot point within the film, then are they given the full fleshing out of a story that they deserve? I think at the same time, we can acknowledge that this is a literally only white film. This is a film that doesn't include any people of color, which makes sense for the setting of it being a rural Mennonite community somewhere in the United States. Like it makes sense that it would be very like monoethnic, but it doesn't represent anyone's point of view that's not white. So that's something that. And I thought about that if they had incorporated people of color, sort of Bridgerton style, where they are doing the kind of blind casting thing where it doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is, they are going to play this character, even if it wouldn't make sense for someone of this skin color to be in this setting at the time. It's like, well, that would have brought a whole different element into the film, right? And would that have been good or bad? Up for debate. But there's definitely some limitations in what perspectives we get from it overall. And it did definitely make me wonder how realistic it was in that sense. Like it is a work of fiction. It's inspired by a true story. Basically, I think just from the premise of what happens, because the preceding events, I think, are pretty much all fictionalized after they discover the serial rapes that are happening in the community. So the idea that something like that's realistic, somebody who's trans getting to live as if they're like within their gender identity, allowing them to wear pants, allowing them to cut their hair short, is that realistic? I don't know. I don't know enough about Mennonites to even say. Yeah. But it definitely brings a little bit of, it made me think and took me out a little bit in sense of like, would this really happen? But I still felt emotionally pulled by his story and like enjoyed what he brought into the film.
Sure.
So,
and one of the things I really appreciate about Sarah Polley and how the script came together and how she directed is it felt very honoring of the Mennonite faith. Like, there was never a point at which I felt like it was degrading the religious expression itself. Yep. It was just how would women in their truest, like, sense of faith react to this type of circumstance. And overall, it felt very honoring of their faith, very honoring of their prayer and their practices and things like that. And that was the one thing I was like, I don't really know like how a Mennonite community might react to a trans person. I mean, in the film, it's played off of, to me, more as like the first step towards tolerating it in the sense that they're like, maybe this is a phase, but we're going to at least call you by your name for now. Like, that's kind of how I interpreted it. So to me, that felt real enough because I didn't interpret that as like a blind, like, we are now trans accepting.
Yeah.
It felt more like
Definitely
well,
not.
this may be what Melvin needs right now. And so I'm going to call him Melvin.
Oh.
Well, and it felt to me a little bit like an act of solidarity because they're going to take Melvin with them.
Yeah.
And so it's like we are you are still part of our flock.
Right.
Even though we don't really understand what's going on and we may not even really like what's going on with you, but like you don't deserve to be left here.
Right.
So you're going to be brought along.
Yeah. And a recognition of like having lived as a woman before, you're still very vulnerable in this community. And like we're going to continue to protect you. Like we're going to protect all the women and children and young boys.
One with Melvin, it was their own brother, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was
and I'm like
horrific.
Like that experience as like a trans person, like being, first of all, just the trauma of everything that's happened, but then like you're, you know, being pregnant and being like Melvin has a monologue about it. Yeah, they miscarried, and he talks about like, I think it was your baby, like to his brother, but I loved this baby. And like, I can't, like, just the process of that, I can't even imagine like what that experience would be like.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of the different characters that are presented in this film, Kellyanne, you've kind of already answered this question for me, but I would like to hear your answer, Kelly, and if you have anything to add, Kellyanne. I was wondering if there was a particular person within the group that we see of women that you resonated with. Kellyanne, it seems your answer is Ona, but it might vary based off of what you said earlier. But was there anyone that you resonated with that was really like, this is the person that I really understand here, or this is the person that I feel represents me even?
Yeah, that's such a great question because there's so many different expressions. I think I felt immediately drawn to Salome, which was Claire Foy's character. No, Claire Foy's character, Salome, I felt very, like, she was just the one I felt immediately drawn to. I tend to feel a lot of anger and, like, want the opportunity to fight against so many of the patriarchal systems that are in place that I've experienced. And I think also she very much took on like a defense of the weaker vessel kind of position. Weaker vessel, that's a terrible word. But she was like, hey, they messed with my kids.
Yeah. Defend the innocent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They messed with my friends. They messed, you know, and so she very much kind of had that like motherly, protective anger about her. And I just found that, I don't know, I was very drawn to that. In terms of like what I do, I don't know if I would like attack someone with a sieve. So
I mean, it's hard to say when you haven't been in that scenario.
I would. 100%.
I'd like, well, that's the thing. I'd like to believe that I would.
Sure.
You know, like maybe, I don't know if that's a good thing, but like sometimes I feel like I could, but I don't know if I actually would. But I find it the most, like I identify the most with it.
Yeah.
But
yeah. I think it's hard because I see a little piece of myself in almost all the characters.
Yeah,
for sure.
Right? And I think they did that on purpose. Like we as humans, as women, are complex creatures with a lot of lived experiences, and the way we react to something one day could be different the next. But I would say out of all of them, I do resonate with the character Ona the most, as well as the one who, I forget her name, but had a panic attack. And there was the reaction.
I can look up her name. I don't know how to say it. Majal? Mejal?
You listener tell us.
However you say that name, she's the one.
Because you see her trying to cope with what is happening, and she's like stressed out and like smoking, and everyone's like shitting on her for smoking. Everyone's like, are you smoking? She's like, fuck off. Yes, I'm smoking. I'm coping. And I'm like, girl, I get you. But sitting there and trying to control what is non-controllable. You cannot stop your body from having an anxiety attack, a panic attack, as much as you can control, like, if you need to burp or not. And so watching her try and control that in a space that everyone, or not everyone, but some people are, like, rolling their eyes and, like, ugh, get a grip. And it's like, she literally can't. She does not have that option.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I get you. So anyway, those are my two main ones. But I would, like, if someone harmed, like, a sister or, you know, a child, I'm like, I think I could lose my shit pretty good and slice a man's throat. Would I be proud of that? later? Probably not.
Maybe we shouldn't put that on the air so that
maybe
you won't be
not.
implicated if you have a future incident.
Well, I think, yeah, like you identify with this idea of like, oh, if I stay, I'll become a murderer.
Yeah.
You know, like obviously that's like to the extreme. And it's maybe, I mean, they use a lot of hyperbole in their language too. Like they're very much, they'll talk about like, well, I just will die, or I guess I'm, you know, going to, like they talk about suicide very candidly. They talk about a lot of really deep topics very candidly. And so to me, it's like there's nuance there in like her literal meaning of that in terms of whether she actually is like premeditating murder.
Oh, I believed her 100%.
But I think that it's beyond. Like I think that it's not just like a literal interpretation. I think it's the sentiment of I could kill someone, and not so much that she literally will. That's my interpretation of it. Again, based on like how they interact and talk about death so flippantly.
Right.
Although at the end we see her, she's the one who gathers weapons for them as they leave.
She is, yeah.
And she's the one who's like, we need to be able to fight, and we need to be able to maybe commit an act as dire as murder if we're in a circumstance.
Yeah.
And so I think her brain is in that mode of this is how we survive, this is how we fight, this is how we advocate for ourselves.
Sure.
And it's a very physical response.
Yeah. Well, and she even hands August, as she leaves, a weapon and says, just in case you need protection.
A weapon that she used on her own son.
Here's
that's what I was
my
going to ask. Did she
line.
trank her son?
For sure. Here's my line. That's the line I drew. I was like, she tranquilized her own son, which could you imagine the guilt of using something that was used on you to take advantage of you sexually and like cause you harm, to use that on your child against his own will?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was very good though, because it's very indicative of like what happens when injustice happens, right? Like you tip the scale in a way that forces people to then like react.
But here's what we see that is so complicated, right? She says, he's my son, he's coming with me. A lot of the men in this community felt these are my women. I am doing to them what I will.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter if consent is involved.
You see that like parallel in that moment, and you're like, oh, like it gave me so much to chew on later, like goosebumps and thoughts, and it was wild.
Yeah, that was something that contributed to me thinking, yes, I do think she is capable of murder.
I'm not saying she's not capable.
No, yeah. But she responds with this physicality. Like she, even when she's just speaking, there's so much fierceness and like presence behind her when she's arguing with the other women that it feels like this is who she is. You know, she is this fireball of a person, and she's willing to go to extreme measures.
She'll protect her own. Like, and I mean, if you had a daughter that was 4, that was sick, and
I'd be ready to kill someone.
Who knows how sick that child would get, right? Yeah. Like if she got an STD for in such a young body, like, oh my God, yeah, hell yeah. Anyway, Emma, who do you identify with the most? Which character?
The person that I identified with the most, actually, let me preface, I did identify a lot with Salome, in the sense of her anger and her short-temperedness. I get that, and I felt deeply for her in that, and I think maybe she's more in line with how I'd react, but maybe not how I would idealize myself to react, because the person that I idealized was definitely Ona. I very much was drawn to her, and she's easily my favorite character out of the whole cast. And I loved the way that she considered everything, the way that she would talk about forgiveness, about how she's the one who says the line, is it really forgiveness if we aren't given another option? And they talk about how forgiveness can often be interpreted as permission instead. And she is the dreamer, but she's also, while maybe dissociated, she is so thoughtful in that we watch her change her mind through the narrative. So she actually gets some flack for that from Salome, where they're like, you wanted to stay and fight, and now you're saying you want to leave. And she's like, well, I'm taking it all in. I'm considering every option. And she's willing to change her mind. And that's probably not my immediate reaction as a person, but I want it to be. And I love that about her, that she was humble, and she also she knew what she wanted. Like when she turns August away, because I thought in my mind, I'm like, the obvious choice is to marry August. Like, you should. Yeah. He's going to give you protection. He's knowledgeable. Like, he is willing to help you raise this child when you have been given this child against your will. And she sticks to what she knows to be true for herself. And I loved that about her. And it was like frustrating, but also so beautiful. And so she's the one that I was the most drawn to, I could say.
I also wanted to like add that like the beauty and the generational like play that they incorporated. Like I really do love the presence of these matriarchal grandmother figures and also like these girls that are a part of this that we haven't talked about as much yet. Like they're like in this conversation, like braiding each other's hair and like just trying to like get the time to pass by. Yeah. And I think again, like generationally, all of us are like, I don't know, identifying most with the women who are like in our age group, like who are in
for sure
the like in the generation we're in. And like, but even being able to see like, I was once the kid that was bored by the long philosophical conversation. I was like, what's the point? Like, we know what happened. Let's just go. You know?
No, there was definitely a time in my life that I'm like, I would have been like, well, obviously we need to leave. Like, that is the only choice. Yeah, like, and I thought I was so smart.
Why is this so complicated? You know, like,
and it seems for a while that the kids aren't really paying attention. But then I think there's one moment where the adults say something about maybe not leaving, and the kids are like, wait, what? Like they perk up because you realize they actually are in tune with this. And then one thing that was really beautiful is at the end they put the kids' drawings on the wall and they've been drawing what's been happening and these stories that they've been telling, and they've been present in their own way. They're not absent from the conversation, but they're engaging in it differently because that's what's accessible to them.
Right. And then the older women are absent in a different way, right? Where they are trying to like love their family, like the not just their literal family, but the extension of family that they've been put in charge of in like this motherly way. But they also have lived with this and accepted this kind of treatment for so long that like they're almost more complicit in it than anyone else. Yeah. And but they also feel like obligated to lead everyone in their faith, and like they're usually the ones who like we'll start a prayer or like we'll take
or a hymn.
Or remind people of like kindness and patience and love and like and so they kind of are a little bit more detached from the reality of the pain that is happening, probably due to the fact that they've experienced so much more of it, right? Like they've spent their time being angry.
Right.
And now they're and I saw a lot of my mom in them. Or like people my mom's age and how they interact with patriarchal norms and the frustration that all of us are experiencing with it is sort of like more of a like less shocked approach to the abuse.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine that they would feel so much guilt too, right? So to admit all of these horrible things and to get angry again would be forced to deal with the inner complicitness and the guilt. And we do see some of that break in one of the older women whose daughter has been abused for a very long time. We talked about it earlier, but they have this really beautiful moment where she breaks down and is like, I should have never let this happen. And so you see that character growth in her, which was really beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, and also like, those are their sons that are committing these acts. And so that, yeah, there must be so much guilt, so much feeling of being complicit.
Yeah.
But one like shorter monologue that I loved was from Agatha, which is Ona's mother, where she talks about how they've never asked the men for anything.
Ooh, I want to read that.
It's so good.
It is
Please
really
read
good.
it.
Because it's really good. Because they, at some point in the conversation, they propose the idea of like, well, why do we have to leave? Why don't we ask them to leave?
Yeah.
That's what Ona says. She says, we could ask the men to leave. And Greta, the older woman, says, ask the men to leave. And then Agatha says, none of us have ever asked the men for anything, not a single thing, not even for the salt to be passed, not even for a penny or a moment alone, or to take the washing in, or to open a curtain, or to go easy on the small yearlings, or to put your hand on the small of my back while I try again for the 12th or 13th time to push a baby out of my body. Isn't it interesting that the one and only request we women would have of the men would be for them to leave? And then they actually laugh.
All the women laugh.
Yes. Yeah, they laugh because it's preposterous.
Yeah.
In the sense of they know that that's not an option.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, I think, like one of those moments of laughing so they don't cry.
Yeah.
Where they're like, yes, this is our reality. You've just expressed the weight of what we live under in this very complementarian system where we're expected to serve the men, and the weight of it is so heavy that we have to laugh in response to this. And that was really beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and the irony too, right? Like, I mean, essentially in this statement, she's saying like, yeah, of course, if you live in a relationship where you're not allowed to ask for anything, the one ask that you would have would be for that other presence to be gone in your life.
Like, get out.
Yeah.
Totally. So I have one sort of open-ended question maybe, which is, this is something I've been like mulling over ever since the first scenes of the movie, that has captivated me, which is that in the beginning of the movie, after a couple of clips that we see, there's text on the screen that says the following is an act of female imagination. And I'm curious to hear what, if any, interpretation you two have of what that means. As the movie opens up with this text, it must be something important, something poignant. But what have you two thought about what that means, or what did you think it meant when you saw it?
To be honest, I actually forgot that happened. However, looking back on this now, I'm like, yeah, like this whole dialogue they have, this whole like playing out and processing, that is what I feel happens in my head all day, every day, and how I think and how I work through the issues of life and try to decide what is right and what is wrong. So I'm like, yeah, I can see this dialogue unfold in my own mind and how I try and like work myself through things, and, you know, the anger and the hurt and the imagination and all the things that come together to hopefully try and make the best decision for myself and for, I mean, not to get like too ooey wooey here, but even like, you know, that parenting that you take on, that self-parenting as an adult in like, am I doing 5-year-old Kelly justice by this? Am I doing 14-year-old Kelly justice by this? Right. And like, how do I care for myself in a holistic sense? And so I find myself having an inner dialogue that we see unfold in this film often of like, well, what about this or this? Or like, what if I change my mind to this? Is that better and more in line with, you know, fill in the blank? I see that wrestling that we experience in the dialogue internally often.
Yeah, that's really good. I interpreted it as a kind of like an audacious act of defiance, I guess, in the sense that even to have an imagination, to think, to use one's critical thinking is not something that women have been given the license to do.
Yeah.
And so in the wake of such tragic news and like tragic realization, they pick up something that they've never really fully been given permission to pick up, which is their brain, like their deeper sense of thought, their critical thinking skills, their prefrontal cortex, right?
Totally.
And they say, like, just the act of us setting out to determine something, to make a decision about something is like a sort of a defiant, audacious act. And so to use our imagination at all. And it's, the sadness of the idea of like the word imagination being used in this context is also really fascinating to me, because usually we associate it with beautiful, thoughtful, dreamer things like Ona. But in this context, it's way heavier than that. And just, I don't know, I think it was very reflective of the burden that women bear, or how I interpreted it. Reflective of the burden that women bear to come to conclusions about like things that happened outside of our control.
Yeah.
And to like make the best decision for our families and to choose love over hate and to choose a path that creates opportunity for forgiveness instead of a path that prevents it. Like all of that I thought was very much something that I identified with as a woman and identified with the women that I know and who women are as like a gender. And that was kind of what I took from it.
Totally. Yeah, it makes me think of they list out the rights they think that they're entitled to.
Yes.
And it's like the right to protect our children. And then the last one is the right to think. And they just, we are entitled to the right to think, which is not a right they've been afforded.
Yes.
Right.
And yeah, I think one of the things that they say in the beginning of the film, as we're being introduced to this horror that's been happening, is that one, they've been told that their rapes have been the result of some sort of demon. But then they also mention that the men said, chalked it up to female hysteria. And I think that that's something that that's the assumption women are affronted with all the time. Like a microaggression version of this I think of is when men say, oh, you must be on your period because you're acting erratically in some way. It's this idea of writing off women's emotions.
Or pain, like not being able to get medical care or like pain management.
There's there's a whole domino effect of what this kind of thinking does to people, and the way that it has put obstacles in front of women that didn't need to be there. And we see that twisting of female imagination, and then we see these women reclaiming female imagination.
Yeah, I like that.
Right? They're saying, you know what, we're going to dare to imagine a life outside of this.
Right. Our hysteria is that we don't want to be abused anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And drugged.
Yes. And so that is something that's been circling through my mind ever since watching this film, is that idea that women get to dare to be confident in themselves, in their thoughts, in what they can make for themselves, because it is, like you said, Kelly, audacious that they would choose to leave, that they would choose with very little practical, like real world skills. They're illiterate. They have never had a job. They are going to then go out into the world of 2010 United States and somehow survive.
Figure out how to make a life for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like that is them acting on that female imagination.
Yeah.
Which, it's so good. And I feel like there's so much that you can delve into from just that sentence.
It circles back to the act of faith, right? Like, I've for so long seen leaving as an act of like, I can't handle this anymore. Like of giving up, of being like too hot, like, I'm trying to figure out what the word exactly is, but it's like, I can't withstand this anymore. Therefore I was required to leave, as opposed to what if the impossible is actually an option to us? The impossible being that we pack up our carts and our children and we start a new life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really good. I have one more kind of maybe, what's the word? One more sort of heavy question for you.
Okay.
Which is something that I thought about the other day, and I was like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think about this before? And maybe you two have thought about this immediately, and I'm just maybe slower to the jump on this, but do you think that August...
Yes!
You don't know what I'm going to ask.
Okay, sorry.
Do you think that August was aware of the sexual assault that was happening?
Yes.
Was he knowledgeable that the men were doing this? Because he's kind of in the in crowd, but he's also not, because he had left the colony with his mother because she was too much of a free thinker, has returned back. Does he know before the men are exposed that they're doing this?
Yes. I absolutely do.
And then, like,
why?
also,
Do you wanna
explain.
Explain.
Yeah,
Yes,
explain.
and
I
then
mean-
also, what does that imply for him as a character?
I will explain. I think throughout this entire movie, you see August, like you've mentioned, very tortured.
Mm-hmm.
He is crying as these women are processing these things. He seems to feel either complicit or guilty in one way. That's how I read it. And at certain points, he even speaks up and is like, well, what about blah, blah, blah? And the women look at him and are like, you're here to take the minutes. You are not here to speak.
Yeah.
And I was like, but you see a repentance in that
Mhm.
of like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, you're so right. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
This is
Although
your
they
thing.
do later tell him that he's free to speak within this
Right.
discourse. I think that it's this balance of he is the listener
Mhm.
there. He is the bystander. And actually, one thing that's interesting, which kind of makes you want to read the book, is that the book is told from his perspective.
Mhm.
Interesting.
But he also is allowed to give input, and he's invited to give input sometimes.
Yes.
But it depends.
It does depend. And then he's the one, like you also said, has the monologue about the boys, about how the boys are dangerous and the boys have been good students. However, the boys can learn. And as the teacher, he is put in a very unique position for this, where it's his job to educate these young men and to be a good example, but also at the same time, he recognizes where their education has been lacking. At one point, you see him come up to Ona and say, I'm so sorry for all this horrible things. I will take care of your child. So you see him take some responsibility. And at the end, you also see him give one of the Claire Foy's character, I forget her name, a gun.
Yeah.
And she looks at him and goes, don't kill yourself, August.
Yeah. She asks him, why do you have a gun? He can't even answer.
You have
she puts the
important work
dots
to
together.
do. Yeah. And so something is going on in August. I think he knew. I dare say, I have queried, perhaps he is the father of Ona's child.
I was wondering if you were going there.
Interesting. I did not consider that.
I didn't consider it until you started talking about it. And then I was like, I think she's about to say that August impregnated her. And
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not clearly stated.
It's not.
But it's
very
possible.
I
We
disagree.
do know that he's been in love with her forever.
Right?
I disagree, but I think it's possible. I hadn't actually considered him being complicit in this at all. Really, I think earlier on in the movie it says how he recently came back because he's been excommunicated for so long.
Yeah.
So in my mind, maybe he sort of arrived as the events came to a close. However, now that we're talking about it, I do think that the fact that he was not invited to come along is maybe an indication of his guilt.
Oh, to go post bail for the men who were...
Oh, to not go with the women.
Oh,
but that is an interesting
yeah.
point too, and that's part of why I maybe thought he hadn't known is because he wasn't invited to go with the men.
Yeah.
He's not really a part of their...
Yeah. He's kind of in a weird limbo.
Right. But it seems like he kind of represents... this is probably where I would land now that I'm talking about it. I feel like he would land in the space of fully complicit but not actively a part of it, right? He's not included in the abuse. He's not included in the group of people that are doing harm to these women. However, he is close enough to them to be aware, but Anyways, but yeah, my thought is the fact, like, did anyone else wonder why he didn't come along?
I did. Yeah, I was like, he should at least go with them.
Yeah.
Like, even if he's not going to be with Ona, like, they should take him.
Like, clearly he's, like,
what are the men going to do to him? They even ask that at one point. Like, what will the men do to you when you're left behind and they realize that you helped us?
Yeah.
And he's like, he's kind of resigned to his fate.
Yeah.
And I think some of that comes from his hopelessness, as he's obviously very tortured. But it's also like, why wouldn't they extend that to him? Because they extend it to the young men. But yeah, maybe there is this thought of he can't be trusted, even though they trust him maybe more than a lot of the other men.
I figured it was because he's an outsider, because he has been gone and came back to the community. And so it's like he is different. Like, he's allowed to be here. We'll give him a shot. But, like, he's not really fully one of us.
Right.
Is how I interpreted it. There's also a scene at the well in which he acts like he's going to tell Ona something and then refrains and stops himself and looks very emotional. And I was like, August, what you been up to,
See,
buddy?
I thought he was going to confess his feelings for her.
Which she
in that
knows,
moment.
though.
Sure, but like,
Just
he hasn't
because you
put
know
words
doesn't
to
mean
them.
it's been said. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think, I disagree. I do not think August sexually assaulted Ona. But that doesn't mean he is innocent.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think I tend to fall in a similar camp as you, Kelly. I do think it's possible that he assaulted Ona. But I also, on the one hand, I don't think he would have come back if he knew that this all was happening, because he had left as a
That's
child.
fair.
And so I don't know that he was aware of it when he left. We don't really know how old he was when he left, but he was old enough to have already fallen in love with Ona. So he was somewhat, I assume he was like a preteen, maybe. I wonder if his mom knew about things that were happening, or if they were even happening back then, and if that was part of why she left. If she had clued him in or not, we don't know. But I imagine that he was kind of ignorant to it when he came back, and that he was then clued in, because while being an outsider, he is still more in with the men than the women would be.
Yeah.
I would imagine. And we don't see him ever interact with another man. But that's the thought pattern that I go into. I could see a world where the men actually exclude him so much that he's totally unaware. But I imagine that his sort of outside knowledge, because you even see there's this really interesting scene where a truck comes by announcing for people to come out to be counted for the 2010 census, and they're playing a song. I forget what song it is, but it's a famous song.
Yeah, I'm forgetting as well.
But you see August singing along to the song, and he knows that song because he was in the outside. And it's bringing you back to that reminder of, oh, he's separate. And so I could see a world where the men don't clue him into these things, or where he realizes these women are thinking that they've been assaulted by demons, but he has his suspicions that it's not that at all.
Yeah.
As someone who has sort of been yanked out of his faith through his mother's descent, and then has decided to return back to it. It's interesting. I think that at some level he must have known, even if not explicitly told.
Yeah, that's what I think. That's probably what I would lean.
How could you, because it's like, how could you not? Like, these women becoming pregnant and becoming,
Yeah, he's university educated. He's not an idiot, right? Like, he doesn't necessarily
the women
believe...
aren't idiots either,
right,
for not
but
knowing.
again, he's like seen...
But they haven't
he's
been
had access to
exposed.
more information than they have, and so he's less likely to be like, I don't know...
Yeah, it's a demon.
Gaslit into believing it's just a demon.
Yeah.
Like, he knows how pregnancy works, you know?
Totally.
So, but he was an interesting character.
He was.
And I think overall an outsider overall, right? Like, he's an outsider in the colony.
Always.
He's probably an outsider outside of the colony.
Yeah.
He doesn't fit in anywhere.
Yeah.
He doesn't, which, I mean, explains some of his hopelessness.
He doesn't belong
Definitely.
in the colony. He doesn't belong with the women leaving the colony. Yeah, so it's very fascinating.
I even, after the film, was thinking about how there were so many scenes in the barn where even if maybe he was in the shot, it felt like he wasn't even there.
Yeah.
Like I would forget that he was there.
Yeah, same.
Because he's so deftly just blended in, and he was kind of forgettable at times. He didn't have this sort of compelling force that the women did in the room, which I think speaks into his mental state as well. And also the reveal at the end that he had the gun to kill himself, that was shocking to me. I actually wasn't anticipating that. I thought maybe he has the gun as just a holdover from his time in the outside world, or something. Like it just didn't register. And then when Salome comes to that conclusion, I was like, oh. And I had read his deep sadness and his deep grief as just a large level of empathy for the women, more than his own like torment going on inside of himself. And so I think some of that subtlety that he played, at least what it read as subtlety to me, also played to the subtlety of somebody who is going through something like that. Anyways, do you two have any final critiques of the film? Anything that you disliked or that maybe you would have done differently? I'll start. I did not love the stylistic choice to desaturate the film.
That was literally my main critique. I'm like, I did not like the color space in the film at all.
I get why she did it. I think that it was an intentional choice from Sarah Polley to sort of teleport you into this other world, to make it feel like it's not part of our world, but then which made it all the more shocking when you did see things that were part of our world, like the truck coming by for the census. But it was like a little too heavy-handed to me. It felt a little bit, it's like this setting is already so separated from the regular everyday American experience that I don't think that it was necessary to color it that way in order to communicate what she was trying to communicate. It didn't ruin the film for me. I was still able to enjoy it, and you sort of get used to it as you get into it, but I didn't love that choice.
I am very much in agreement with you. Like from the very beginning, even from the trailers, I immediately did. I mean, typically, I don't like that look overall anyways, but it's sort of like playing into this like dystopian horror realm.
Which I did feel scared sometimes in the film.
And
I thought something scary was going to happen. In some of the cutaway scenes, it felt like you felt so tense.
Sure.
And that was done really well.
But I think like what you brought up in terms of how heavy-handed it is my biggest critique of it, in the sense that like she could have leaned in that direction without being so like overt. Where so much else in the film is so subtle and nuanced, and like for example, she doesn't show violence. Like she doesn't show the actual violence happening, which I think was a brilliant choice. The film itself is not about the violence happening. It's about the decision afterwards. And also like, we don't need to re-traumatize or traumatize the audience. Totally. Like to make them understand, it was just, it would have been unnecessary. Yeah. So I found like her decision to kind of to lean into the subtlety and the nuance of life. And then the color space was just like, this is bad. Like dystopian, scary universe. I don't know. That was, very much in agreement.
Yeah. When it comes to, you just made me think of, this isn't even a critique. This is actually a positive thing. But the fact that they don't show the violence, that you see the aftermath of sexual assault and you see all that comes afterwards, I think was really beautiful and was a really good choice. It reminded me a lot of another film that came out recently, She Said, about the sexual assault that, why am I forgetting his name out of
Harvey
nowhere?
Weinstein.
Harvey Weinstein, thank you. That Harvey Weinstein committed against these women. And in that film as well, you never see the acts committed, but you'll see like before and after. You will see the impact that it has on the women, and you never see Harvey Weinstein in the entire film about Harvey Weinstein. And that was incredible to me, and the way that they chose to communicate that. And so I'm loving this trend in like feminist filmmaking to choose to not traumatize the audience further.
And omit the men.
Yes.
Like this is not about the perpetrators. This is about the people.
Yes, exactly.
And how they're dealing with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was phenomenal.
Very much agree.
But anyways, back to critiques.
How about you, Cal?
I would say I actually didn't mind the coloring. I do agree that it was pretty intense. It was like the first thing I noticed. But I did as an audience member that is not an expert in all these things, I did like the communication of like they live differently. Like the way they experience the world is muted compared to how you experience the world. And so I felt like for me, I understood more of like their way of life and like maybe how they would experience the world more clear right off the bat. And so it did kind of help me set the tone, but I could have done a little less of it. It was very noticeable.
I mean, it like took away, I think, from like just the beauty of film as a whole. But I mean, maybe in the sense that was part of her intention, is that we're not going to romanticize this world, right? Like maybe she was specifically just like trying to
doing that on
direct
purpose.
Focus to the conversation at hand and not so much like this.
It's a little bit more
space.
like utilitarian in that sense.
It felt very brutalist.
Yeah, for sure. I think, honestly, there's not much I would change off the bat. If I had time to think about it, maybe I would have other things. But
that's totally fair.
I mean, like I said, I was really mesmerized by the movie and actually want to watch it again
Same.
and
Gotta
think
read the
about
book.
it.
I want to read the script.
Oh my gosh, it's on the way right now. I ordered it.
Love that.
Of course you did.
So overall, I think it really piqued my interest in these types of communities in general, not even from a stance of like what crimes are going on that aren't reported, but like just like, hey, your experience of life is really different. Like, I want to talk about that. I want to understand that. Because, I mean, like we've said multiple times, there's so much beauty that comes out of this really horrific situation. And these women have so much grace and poise and love in their hearts to give. When I'm like, you have every right to have zero love now. And so, anyway, there's not much I would change.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of critiques. I did want to say, too, that I loved the expression of feminism in different forms, right? Like, because honestly, like from a one-on-one, like me next to a Mennonite person who probably is in their context in 2010, and like the types of beliefs that we have were probably very different on like in terms of like policy and law and even complementarianism and marriage. And like we probably have very different viewpoints, but the idea that all women are privy to the right to seek independence for themselves, to seek the life they want to live for themselves. And like feminism can take form in the most conservative of places. I liked that a lot. Sort of the dichotomy there.
Yeah, that was good.
One other small critique that I do have is I think there are a couple times where the film attempted to bring some levity that I don't think worked as well. So there's one moment with the older woman who has the horses where she says she thinks that she's dying because her glasses have fogged or have gotten dusty.
Oh, right.
And they're like, haha, Cicely, you're not dying. Like, it's okay. And they clean her glasses off for her. And that to me, it was like, it jarred me a little bit because it didn't blend well to me.
Yeah.
There's another moment where they're like, sometimes like you have to laugh as much as you cry, and they're all laughing. And that felt off to me as well.
And then, I loved it.
And then there's another moment where they sing a hymn together, and that also felt off to me. I think there are other times where Sarah Polley brings levity that work. Like when you pivot to watching the children braid each other's hair, or when the same woman with her horses, when she tells the stories about her horses, they are like really charming fables, and they do bring some levity as you see just like this old woman who loves her horses and like learns from them. Or when we just see depictions of like children playing in the fields together. Those, I think, brought levity in a way that was more digestible and like fit better for me. Whereas those other moments didn't work as well for me. And they felt a little clumsy.
Ooh, I loved that. Like, to me, it felt so real. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever been like in a conversation. Like, it reminded me of times that I've been like tears streaking down my face. I've been heaving sobs, and then my friends are there or my husband's there or whatever. And someone says something that's funny, and like you almost need that release of like, we've got to, like, you can't like sob for eternity, right? Like emotions are so up and down, and there's like such a roller coaster when it comes to grief or fear or anger, all of those things. And I loved that. Like, it felt like the humor reminded me of some of the more conservative people I remember from my childhood that was very like self-deprecating almost, and like a teasing. Like, I don't know, it felt very familiar to me actually overall. And so I thought it was really well done. So I love that.
Did you guys almost shit your pants when you thought that young girl jumped to her death?
Yes.
Yes, that was horrifying.
I was like, what?
I was pissed. I was like,
what is this movie doing? And that actually
that
kind of
was
was
one of those
another one where I
moments.
was like, it didn't work for me.
Yeah, that moment didn't work for me either.
But again, to me, I think that was it, like the film reinforcing this is a different space, right? Like these women, despite purporting all of these like feminist thoughts and having all these deep conversations and philosophical conversations, are still very much in like a different context. And so like a joke about killing yourself to them is funny, even though it is like very anti what we would agree is something you can laugh at in our world. And so that to me, like, I felt like it was more a way of exemplifying the context that they're in, which I really liked.
Yeah, it's hard for me to even like accept that that's something they would find funny, considering that they talk about a woman who does kill herself because of the abuse that they're facing. And I'm like, oh, how could they hold that in one hand and have it be humorous in another? Like that one was hard for me, personally. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Not something I actually found funny for me, but I felt like it was a dissonance that was intentional. Like they're trying to make you feel uncomfortable. But
Well, it definitely made me feel uncomfortable.
Yep.
it does accomplish that for sure.
So, ladies, this film is up for Best Picture and for Best Adapted Screenplay. Tragically, no Best Director nomination, no
Rude.
Best Actress, no Best Supporting
on,
Actress.
guys.
Not even Claire Foy?
No one.
Oh my
Come on,
goodness.
guys.
Yeah. But I'm curious, do you two think that they'll win either of their categories? Or any opinions in that regard?
I think it'll win Best Adapted Screenplay. I don't know about Best Picture. That one's always kind of a toss-up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Best Picture, I feel like, is getting increasingly harder to
predict.
predict.
Yep.
Yeah, I tend to find this hard to predict in general.
Yeah.
But
Or at least I hope that it gets
yeah.
everything it's nominated for.
I think it has a shot at Best Adapted Screenplay.
Yeah.
I don't think it probably will win Best Picture because Best Picture is usually rated off of the most average of all of the films.
Right.
And I think this one is a little bit too auteuristic, a little bit too art house for people to like resonate with it on a global scale.
Yeah.
So that's my prediction. I would imagine possibly adapted screenplay. However, there's a lot of good scripts out there this year. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it could have a good shot. And it's adapted screenplay, so that makes it a little bit of a narrower field since it's adapted from a book. But I have to agree. I'm not sure that it has a shot at Best Picture, but Best Adapted Screenplay, I could see it winning. So, ladies, the classic question, is this film Woman Being Approved?
that, yes.
I mean, women talking, woman being. Like,
Woman being
could you
sitting there
draw
talking.
a better parallel?
Sounds like maybe we should do a collab. Maybe we should call
Oh
up
my
Sarah
God.
Polley.
Oh my gosh, I would die.
die.
I listened to a podcast just interviewing her and the cast just about the film and stuff. And she talks about like her ethos of like how she runs a set.
Mhm.
And she was like so thoughtful about making sure that her doing this film wasn't going to like ruin her family. And so they had like 10-hour days on set. And they and she went through great cares to make sure the child actors were taken care of, having been a child actor herself. And anyways, they talk about all the things that they did to like take care of the cast and crew and even just the production of the film, which is a contrast to like Don't Worry, Darling, which is another female-directed film that got a lot of negative press earlier this year. So it's like there's a way that filmmaking, the art itself can be beautiful, but the way that it's done can also be beautiful. And so that's not to say that it's a perfect set or anything like that, but as a woman who's trying to figure out like, how do I navigate the film industry in my own career, it's encouraging to know that there are people and there are ways to do it without killing yourself.
Yeah.
So,
especially considering this is so much a film about humanity and respect and how to navigate the world with dignity and like love as the most present ideals. And so to conduct a film set that also like strives towards those ideals is really, it's really cool to see that more holistic ethos come from Sarah Polley.
Yeah. Because I'm like, I know enough people who have worked in Christian films, like, know people who have been on sets or people who know people who have been on sets, to know that usually the sets don't reflect the ethos and the love for people.
Yeah.
And so, like when you actually see someone live out what they also preach, it's nice.
Yeah.
It's refreshing.
For sure. All right, ladies. Thank you so much for all of your riveting input and diving into all the nuance and depth that this film contains. I feel like we could talk for another hour about this at least and dive into so much more. That's one thing that I love about this film. It is very layered. It is something that makes you think and that gets you talking, just like the women talking in the film.
Wow. And
if you, dear listener, like listening to these women talking, then I would encourage you to give us a review on Apple Podcasts.
Yes, please.
Give us 5 stars on Spotify and to follow us on our socials. We're on Instagram and TikTok as Women Being Podcasts. We're on YouTube. We have a website, womenbeingcommunity.com, and you can follow along and see what kind of content we're coming out with. Do you want us to review another movie? Let us know. Give us the rec. Do you want us to review another book? Let us know. Do you have anything, any input, anything that you want to say to us? We're here. Slide into our DMs. We want to hear from you because we are all about women talking.
Also, thanks, Sarah Polley. If you want to be on our podcast at any time, we're here for you.
Yeah, I'm sure you're listening.
100%.
Please have
Girl.
your people contact our people
Yes.
ASAP. Thank you.
Exactly. I'm sure that will work. So next week we will have Sarah Polley.
Next week. Wow.
Yeah.
Her schedule's open,
Yep, she's ready for us. Just kidding, but seriously, if anyone knows anyone that knows Sarah Polley, then just hook us up. All that to say, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. We will catch all of you next week with another piping hot, fresh episode from the Woman Being Studio. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.